The morning of June 6, 1944, began not with glory, but with confusion. A cold wind blew across the grey waters of the English Channel, whipping spray against the hulls of hundreds of vessels that filled the horizon. Among them rode a strange silhouette, neither ship nor truck, something in between. To the German coastal observers peering through binoculars from concrete bunkers along Normandy's beaches, it looked almost laughable. "They are bringing trucks to sea now," one soldier reportedly muttered, smirking. "The Americans must think the channel is a highway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." But the object slicing through the whitecaps that morning was no joke. It was the DUKW, pronounced Duck, a six-wheeled amphibious truck that would soon deliver more supplies per hour than any other vehicle in the invasion fleet. And though it looked ungainly, almost comical, it would quietly become one of the most vital tools in the Allied arsenal, bridging the impossible gap between sea and land when every other plan began to falter. By nightfall, over 150,000 Allied soldiers had landed along 50 miles of coastline, and yet, by the next morning, commanders faced a more dangerous threat than German fire: paralysis. The beaches were choked with men, vehicles, and supplies that could not move inland fast enough. Bulldozers sank in soft sand, trucks bogged down in surf, and landing craft had to retreat before incoming tide trapped them. Fuel drums piled up near the waterline, where artillery shells could find them easily. Logistics officers had spent years planning for the landings, but now their carefully drawn diagrams were unraveling, and at the center of that chaos was a quiet miracle on 6 wheels, one that had been mocked by engineers, doubted by generals, and almost cancelled entirely before it ever saw combat. 3 years earlier, in 1941, when the DUKW was still a sketch on a drafting table in Detroit, the idea seemed absurd. An amphibious truck? It sounded like something out of a circus rather than an army. Even the US Navy laughed. "We already have landing craft," one officer reportedly said. "Why would anyone want a truck that swims?" The Germans, too, believed they understood mobility. They prized engineering elegance, panzer precision, half-tracks with interleaved wheels, pontoon bridges assembled with Teutonic efficiency. To them, the American tendency toward quantity over refinement was a sign of mechanical laziness. The concept of a floating truck seemed to confirm their bias, but necessity, not pride, would decide who understood war. The origins of the DUKW traced back to the General Motors Corporation, specifically its yellow truck and coach division. In 1941, the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development approached GM with a problem. America's landing craft could unload troops, but not supplies beyond the beachhead. Everything had to be manhandled through surf and sand. They needed a vehicle that could drive directly off a cargo ship, float to shore, then continue inland without pause. It was an impossible hybrid. A truck had to be watertight yet light enough to float. It had to steer both in water and on land, survive surf conditions, and still carry 2.5 tons of cargo. There was no precedent, no manual, no existing design to copy. Donald Roebling, the eccentric Florida inventor behind the Alligator amphibious tractor, had pioneered similar concepts for rescue missions in swamps and hurricanes, but his machines were heavy, slow, and built for civil use. What the military demanded now was mass production, battlefield ruggedness, and precision engineering that could survive saltwater, sand, and bullets. General Motors engineers began experimenting in secret at Pontiac, Michigan, welding hulls from sheet steel and fitting them over the standard GMC CCKW truck chassis. The result was ungainly, a long, rounded hull with 6 exposed wheels and a propeller at the rear. To the engineers, it looked like an oil drum with tires. To soldiers, it looked like a prank. Even its name sounded foolish, DUKW. It wasn't a word, but a code. D for 1942 production year, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. Pronounced aloud, however, it became Duck, and the nickname stuck instantly. In early tests on the Great Lakes, The DUKW performed well enough on calm water, but its flaws became obvious in waves. The steering wheel turned sluggishly, the bilge pumps leaked, and the propeller sometimes jammed in sand. The Army's Ordnance Department, already skeptical, recommended cancellation. No practical value in combat conditions, the report read. The project would likely have died there, if not for one of the strangest twists in American wartime innovation, a hurricane off the coast of Massachusetts. In December 1942, a Coast Guard vessel ran aground near Provincetown in heavy surf. Rescue teams failed to reach it. A group of GM engineers offered to send one of their prototype DUKWs, still in testing nearby. Against all expectations, it survived 30-knot winds, plunged through breaking waves, and rescued 7 stranded Coast Guardsmen. That night, the phone lines between Washington and Detroit lit up. Suddenly, the Duck had a future. By early 1943, DUKWs were rolling off assembly lines. Their specifications were modest but ingenious. They used the same 270 cubic-inch engine as the standard GMC truck, with 6-wheel drive, a transfer case for land or marine operation, and a propeller driven directly from the transmission. A single lever engaged or disengaged the screw, while a small rudder at the stern allowed water steering, through a linkage from the front wheels. The hull was watertight, fitted with an air compressor system that allowed drivers to adjust tire pressure on the move, high for roads, low for sand or mud, a feature so far ahead of its time that modern off-road vehicles still use the same principle. It was not armoured, nor was it fast. On land, it could reach about 50 miles per hour. In water, 6.5. But what mattered was what it could do. Carry over 5,000 pounds of cargo, from ammunition crates to field artillery shells, and deliver them directly from ship to front line without cranes, docks, or piers. At first, the troops laughed. The DUKW looked like something designed for a children's parade. Marines called it Donald Duck's Revenge. Sailors nicknamed it the Floating Deuce. Even within the Army, units were reluctant to use them seriously. But in the Mediterranean, the laughter faded fast. During the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, DUKWs carried 90% of all supplies landed in the first 48 hours. When storm surf forced traditional landing craft to halt, the Ducks kept running. One unit commander wrote afterward, "Without them, we would have lost 2 days, and possibly the beachhead." Still, German intelligence barely noticed. To them, the DUKW was an oddity of American excess, another over-engineered gadget in an army full of them. They did not yet understand that these ungainly machines represented a revolution in logistics, a weapon that could outpace terrain, weather, and tide. As spring turned to summer in 1944, Allied planners gathered in southern England for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Western Europe. They prepared Mulberry harbours, floating piers, and LST landing ships to handle the tidal variations of the French coast. But among those preparations, one line item drew little attention. DUKW companies assigned to each beach sector. There were about 2,000 of them ready, painted olive drab, their drivers trained in both seamanship and trucking. They were organised into amphibious truck companies under the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, a branch often overlooked by historians but essential to the war's outcome. Their mission was brutally simple: to keep supplies moving, no matter what. On the morning of June 6th, as waves broke over the bow of the first DUKWs, leaving their motherships, many of the young drivers, barely 20 years old, gripped their steering wheels and tried not to look at the sea ahead. Some prayed, others joked nervously over radio. When the ramps dropped, they drove straight into the grey water, engines roaring, propellers biting, hulls rocking violently as bullets hissed around them. In the chaos of Omaha and Utah beaches, many DUKWs sank before reaching shore, overloaded or caught broadside by waves. Yet hundreds made it through, delivering everything from ammunition to anti-aircraft guns directly onto sand where conventional craft could not. Those that survived kept working without pause, running round trips for 16 hours a day. To German soldiers watching from the cliffs, the sight was bewildering. American trucks swimming through surf, climbing over waves, driving straight onto the beach without stopping. It looked like madness. But by the end of that day, as German lines began to buckle under the weight of Allied material pouring ashore, the joke no longer seemed funny. Because what the Germans didn't yet realize was that they weren't just fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting an industrial civilization that had learned how to make the sea itself a road. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the second day of the invasion, the beaches of Normandy were choking on their own success. Piles of crates, jerry cans, ammunition belts, and fuel, drums rose like miniature fortresses of their own. Men worked knee-deep in mud, shouting over the thunder of artillery and surf, trying to drag tons of material to the rising front lines inland. Landing craft waited impatiently offshore, unable to unload before the tide turned. Trucks that made it to shore bogged down almost immediately. The Allied beachmasters, the officers charged with maintaining order in this chaos, were losing control. The arithmetic was merciless. A single division needed 700 tons of supplies per day to fight effectively. A corps needed 5,000. And as the front expanded, every mile gained inland demanded another mile of overland hauling. By the evening of June 7th, the carefully timed landing schedules had disintegrated. The famous Mulberry artificial harbours, those vast floating piers designed to solve this very problem, had not yet been fully assembled. Even when completed, they would take days to stabilise. The only machines that could move supplies directly from ship to front without waiting for tide or harbour were the DUKWs. All across the invasion sector, from Utah to Gold, these odd six-wheeled craft became lifelines. They churned through the surf, propellers clawing at the grey water, carrying everything from artillery shells to medical supplies. They ferried the wounded back to hospital ships, then returned laden with rations. Some drivers ran more than 20 trips a day without rest. At Omaha Beach, a captain of the 453rd Amphibious Truck Company recorded in his log, "Sea state rough, surf heavy, landing craft standing off, DUKWs only vehicles operating. Continued resupply operations under fire." His handwriting wavered across the page, the ink smeared by seawater and exhaustion. When one of the great Channel storms struck on June 19th, waves as high as 20 feet tore apart the British Mulberry Harbour at Arromanches and wrecked hundreds of landing craft. For a moment, the entire invasion hung by a thread. Supplies could no longer be offloaded through traditional means, yet the DUKWs kept going. They were battered, soaked, sometimes capsized, but they did not stop. For a week, they carried almost every ton of cargo that reached the beaches. It was this moment, more than any other, that transformed the DUKW from novelty to necessity. Allied commanders began speaking of them with near reverence. A British officer wrote in his report, "The DUKW is to our operations what the horse was to Wellington, indispensable, tireless, and always there when needed." Even German intelligence began to take notice. Reports filtered through from coastal units describing trucks which swim ashore and vehicles moving from ship to land without aid. At first, analysts dismissed the accounts as exaggerations, but by mid-July, as captured photographs reached Berlin, disbelief gave way to grudging admiration. One Wehrmacht logistics officer reportedly remarked, "They have made the sea their road." For German soldiers on the ground, the implications were terrifying. In every previous invasion, supply had been the attacker's weakness. The sea was a barrier, the beaches a bottleneck. If the Allies could move fuel, ammunition, and guns directly from ship to front line, their momentum could become unstoppable. The Atlantic Wall, conceived as an unbreakable fortress, had been breached not just by courage, but by engineering that made the impossible routine. Meanwhile, the DUKW drivers themselves, many of them ordinary truckers and mechanics from the Midwest, were living through the war's most thankless heroism. Their days began before dawn and ended long after dark. They navigated by dead reckoning through fog and shellfire, guided only by compass bearings and dim shoreline lights. Steering in the channel's shifting currents required the touch of a sailor and the nerve of a pilot. Each DUKW was loaded by crane from a Liberty ship's hold, lowered into the sea, and driven to shore through surf that would have terrified most small boat crews. Once beached, the driver shifted into low gear, raised tire pressure for traction, and powered through sand toward the supply dumps inland. Then, empty, they would race back down the beach, deflate the tires for flotation, and plunge into the sea again. Losses were constant. Mines, hidden obstacles, and gunfire claimed many. Yet the units kept operating with remarkable efficiency. The 470th Amphibious Truck Company, for example, delivered over 90% of all ammunition to the front during the first month of fighting in Normandy, an achievement unmatched by any other transport unit in the war. The logistical ripple effect was enormous. Where earlier invasions had stalled for lack of supplies, the Normandy build-up accelerated relentlessly. By the end of June, over 1 million men, 150,000 vehicles, and 500,000 tons of supplies had been landed. Nearly a third of that cargo had touched a DUKW at some point in its journey. The Germans, accustomed to viewing logistics as a weakness of mechanized warfare, could scarcely comprehend it. Nazi propaganda had long mocked American industry as chaotic and unrefined, a machine that produced abundance but not brilliance. Yet here was brilliance hidden inside abundance, a vehicle so simple, so reliable, that it multiplied the power of every other weapon in the Allied arsenal. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inspected the shattered beaches weeks later, he saw the wreckage of mulberries and the carcasses of burnt-out landing craft. But mixed among them were dozens of DUKWs, still functional, still moving crates inland. He reportedly turned to his aide and said quietly, "That is how they win wars, not with one weapon, but with 1,000 little ones that never stop working." By late summer, as the Allied breakout from Normandy turned into a race across France, the DUKWs followed every advance. They crossed the Seine, ferried supplies over the Rhine, and rolled through mud and rubble where bridges had been blown. In Antwerp and Rotterdam, they delivered supplies from ships directly into liberated cities, bypassing ruined ports entirely. Each DUKW carried about 2.5 tons per trip, but in the aggregate, they moved entire armies. And unlike most vehicles of war, they became symbols not of destruction but of endurance. Soldiers began painting cartoon ducks on their hulls, giving them names the Lucky Goose, Aqua Deuce, Liberty Bell. For the men who drove them, they were more than machines, they were survival. The Germans had laughed at first. Then they had watched in disbelief. And finally, they understood. When the American DUKWs could swim over rivers that German engineers had destroyed, when they could resupply armor before German fuel convoys even left their depots, when they could land guns and food wherever the front demanded, then the war's momentum shifted irreversibly. Because in the end, the DUKW wasn't just a truck. It was a philosophy, mobility without boundaries. It turned the one element that had always limited war, the divide between land and sea, into an extension of the highway. In war, that kind of transformation happens only once in a generation. By the spring of 1945, the DUKWs had gone everywhere the war went. From the beaches of Sicily to the flooded lowlands of Holland, from the icy waves of the English Channel to the shattered bridges of the Rhine, the same humble six-wheeled amphibians kept the Allied advance alive. When the German front finally broke and Allied tanks rolled through Cologne, DUKWs were there too, carrying shells and fuel across rivers choked with wreckage, delivering the supplies that made the last push to Berlin possible. They had become invisible in their indispensability. Soldiers joked that, if you don't know where it came from, it probably came on a DUKW. But as the guns fell silent, their story began to fade. Victory had a way of spotlighting the glamorous, the bombers, the tanks, the aces, the generals. No one made recruiting posters for logistics. When the first victory parades marched through Paris, London, and New York, There were no DUKWs rolling down the avenue. Most were already being left behind rusting in European fields, sold to local farmers, or scrapped for metal. The war had ended, but the quiet heroes of supply had no monument. Still, for a brief moment, the world understood what they had done. General Eisenhower himself called the DUKW one of the most important pieces of equipment we had in the European theatre. A senior British officer described it even more bluntly. Without the DUKW, we would not have won. Yet back home, the engineers who built it, the General Motors team, led by Rod Stevens of Sparkman and Stevens Yacht Builders and naval architect Frank W. Spear of the National Defense Research Committee, simply returned to their ordinary lives. They'd designed a machine that had rewritten the physics of invasion, and then, just as quickly, the world moved on. In post-war America, many surplus DUKWs were auctioned off for pennies. Some went to fire departments for flood rescues. Others ferried tourists around harbours and lakes. The same vehicles that had once charged through surf under machine gun fire now carried laughing families through peaceful waterways, their engines still growling with that distinctive amphibious rhythm. But in the memories of the men who had driven them, the DUKW was never just a novelty. It was the one machine that never complained, never quit, and never failed when the sea turned against them. They remembered how a DUKW could find a path when every bridge was gone, how it could carry food to starving civilians when roads were shattered, how it could haul ammunition to a front line no truck could reach. In 1944, when the Great Channel Storm destroyed the Mulberry Harbour, one DUKW driver wrote in his diary, "They said the sea had beaten us, but the ducks don't care what the sea says." Decades later, that line would appear in a museum exhibit, a quiet epitaph for the nameless thousands who kept the invasion alive, one load at a time. By the 1,950 the DUKWs were fading from service. The Korean War used them again, briefly, to move supplies through mud and flooded rivers, but new amphibious vehicles soon replaced them. In Vietnam, a few still carried cargo up the Mekong, their engines coughing with age, and by the 1,970 they were gone from active duty entirely. But their legacy lived on in every modern amphibious transport that followed in the Lark, the BV-206, and even the landing craft of today. Each carried a bit of that same DNA, the idea that logistics could conquer the boundaries of terrain. And quietly, in the archives of the National World War II Museum and the Imperial War Museum, the DUKW has earned the respect it always deserved. Because for all its ungainly shape, it was one of the rare machines that changed what an army could be. When German commanders watched DUKWs swim ashore at Normandy, they understood not just that America had found a clever machine, but that it had found a new way of thinking, a way that made geography irrelevant, a way that made distance bend to will, a way that turned the sea, once the greatest barrier to conquest, into just another road. In the end, the DUKW did more than win battles. It proved that victory doesn't always belong to the loudest weapons or the boldest generals. Sometimes it belongs to the quiet things, to the grey machines that never stop, to the men who drive through storms without glory, and to the ducks that swam toward history while the world laughed. They called them ducks. But when the sea raged and the beaches burned, those ducks carried an army on their backs. The war ended, but the work didn't. For the men who had driven the DUKWs across Normandy surf, over flooded French fields, and up the banks of shattered rivers, peace felt strangely quiet. They had lived for years by the rhythm of the tides, rising with dawn convoys, loading under the roar of naval guns, guiding their ducks through chaos toward order. When the shooting stopped, the silence felt unnatural. Many of them came home with nothing more than grease-stained notebooks, faded photographs, and the peculiar pride of having served in a branch of the war no one talked about. They weren't bomber pilots or tank commanders, they were amphibious truck drivers. Yet, for a few brief months in 1944, their machines had been the most important vehicles in Europe. For the Army Transportation Corps, demobilization was a logistical miracle of its own. By late 1945, thousands of DUKWs were lined up in depots across Britain, France, and Italy. Some were sold to Allied governments rebuilding shattered coastlines. Others were left behind, their engines salted and silent. A few, scavenged by civilians, found strange second lives. In the harbours of Marseille, fishermen bought surplus DUKWs for the equivalent of $50 apiece. They patched the hulls with scrap metal and used them to haul nets or ferry goods between islands. In Greece, they became makeshift ferries, carrying families and livestock across narrow channels where bridges had been destroyed. One Greek farmer was said to have used his DUKW to transport olives by sea and then, without stopping, drive the same load directly to market. In post-war Italy, enterprising contractors used them to clear rubble from bombed-out cities. They could float down the Po River, scoop up debris, and crawl up onto ruined streets without cranes or docks. The DUKW, designed for war, had become a tool for rebuilding peace. Yet, for the men who built them, the end of the war marked a quiet disbanding. General Motors engineers, who had worked under strict secrecy, returned to civilian projects. Rod Stevens, the yacht designer whose naval expertise had helped make the DUKW seaworthy, went back to building racing sailboats. He rarely spoke about the vehicle afterward. To him, it had been a practical problem solved in a time of crisis, not an invention for glory. But others knew better. At the U.S. Army's Transportation School, instructors began using the DUKW as a case study in engineering design. It represented everything the Army wanted in a vehicle: adaptability, simplicity, and the ability to turn terrain itself into an ally. They taught its principles for decades: how tire inflation systems allowed seamless transition from sea to land, how hull shape balanced buoyancy and traction, and how redundant controls ensured survival even under fire. One major wrote in a post-war report, "The DUKW exemplified the American genius for practical imagination, the capacity to turn the impossible into standard operating procedure." By the time the Korean War erupted in 1950, many of those same ducks were called out of retirement. Painted anew in olive drab, they rolled once again onto beaches, this time at Incheon, one of the most daring amphibious operations in military history. Incheon's tides were the highest in the world, 30-foot surges that stranded ships twice a day. Normal landing craft could operate only for a narrow window at high tide, but the DUKWs, with their amphibious drive and deep water capability, became the bridge between sea and shore. They carried ammunition and rations directly to General MacArthur's advancing infantry, crossing mudflats that would have swallowed other vehicles whole. Reports from the field read like echoes of Normandy: surf heavy, roads impassable, DUKWs only vehicles able to maintain supply line. One old veteran of the European landings, now a sergeant in Korea, was overheard telling a younger driver, "Kid, if you trust the duck, she'll bring you home." They weren't wrong. The DUKWs operated in Korea for 3 long years, surviving monsoons, artillery, and freezing river crossings. When the fighting finally ended in 1953, some of them were nearly a decade old, still running, still swimming, still defying every expectation of a temporary war machine. After Korea, the DUKW's military career should have ended, but history had other plans. During the 1,960 seconds, the United States found itself wading into another distant conflict, Vietnam. There, too, the geography was unforgiving. The Mekong Delta, with its endless web of waterways, had no proper roads for trucks or tanks. Once again, the old amphibians were pressed back into service. They carried supplies up narrow rivers, ferried troops between jungle outposts, and evacuated civilians during floods. By now, they were antiques patched with tin, their engines coughing black smoke, but the soldiers who used them swore by their reliability. In one U.S. Army report from 1967, a logistics officer wrote, "The DUKW remains the only vehicle capable of uninterrupted service between deep water and inland terrain without port facilities. Obsolete on paper, indispensable in the field." When the last of them were finally retired in the early 1972, many had outlived 2 generations of newer designs. But even as the world moved into the jet age, the DUKW refused to fade entirely. Civilian life found new uses for it in peace, as creative as its wartime role. In the United States, hundreds were sold to fire departments for flood rescues. Their ability to drive through submerged streets made them invaluable during hurricanes. In Louisiana, one fire chief called it the only truck that can swim faster than the water rises. Elsewhere, the DUKW found a more light-hearted afterlife. In the 1940 seconds and 50 seconds, surplus vehicles were bought by entrepreneurs who turned them into amphibious tour buses. Painted bright yellow, they became tourist attractions in Boston, San Francisco, London, and Singapore. The same engines that once roared through Normandy surf now carried tourists past historic skylines. The passengers laughed as the vehicles splashed into the water, unaware that decades earlier those waves had been filled with gunfire and blood. There was irony in that transformation, a war machine reborn as a symbol of peace and novelty. But to the veterans who watched, it was strangely comforting. The ducks had survived. For historians, the DUKW's story revealed something deeper than mechanical ingenuity. It embodied a principle that defined the Allied victory itself, that logistics, not luck, wins wars. The DUKW was not glamorous. It did not destroy enemy tanks or win dogfights in the sky, but it ensured that those who did had food, fuel, and ammunition when they needed it. Every shell fired by a Sherman tank, every ration eaten by a GI on the march, every gallon of fuel that kept a jeep moving inland at some point, it had likely passed through the bed of a DUKW. It was the connective tissue of the Allied war machine, and like all connective tissue, it worked best when invisible. In the decades after the war, military theorists began to study logistics as an art form. The DUKW became a case study in what they called distributed mobility, the idea that instead of building larger ships or trucks, success lay in creating vehicles that could cross multiple environments. The Cold War's new generation of amphibious craft, from the U.S. Marines' Lark series to the Soviet PTS transporters, all borrowed from the DUKW's DNA. Even NASA engineers studying lunar rovers in the 1960 seconds cited the DUKW's suspension and tire pressure system as inspiration for all-terrain adaptability. In a sense, the DUKW's spirit had left Earth long before any astronaut planted a flag. Yet, despite its influence, the DUKW slowly vanished from memory. Its metal corroded in junkyards. Its name became a curiosity, a word that sounded more like a toy than a tool. In museums, it was often overshadowed by tanks and aircraft. In documentaries, its presence was reduced to a passing image, a strange truck half submerged in grey surf. Only those who had relied on it remembered its importance. One veteran, interviewed in 1989, summed it up simply: "People think the war was won by the men who fired the guns. Maybe so. But they only had those guns because we could reach them. The DUKW was our bridge, and bridges don't get medals." Still, history has a way of rediscovering its quiet heroes. In the early 2000s, restoration groups across the United States and Europe began recovering surviving DUKWs from barns, beaches, and scrapyards. They rebuilt them piece by piece, engines polished, hulls resealed, propellers refitted. When these restored vehicles rolled into parades or veterans' gatherings, they drew astonished looks. Children stared, older men nodded in recognition. A few veterans touched the metal with trembling hands, whispering to their families, "I drove one of those." In 2019, at the 75th anniversary of D-Day, a line of fully restored DUKWs crossed the surf at Normandy once again. The crowd watched in silence as their wheels hit the beach, water streaming from their sides. For a moment, the decades folded into each other. The ghosts of the past seemed to ride with them. A British veteran of the Royal Army Service Corps, now in his 90s, saluted as they came ashore. "Those little trucks," he said, did more for victory than most men will ever know. Beyond commemoration, the DUKW left behind an enduring legacy in disaster response. During Hurricane Katrina in 2005, modernized DUKWs were deployed to rescue stranded civilians in New Orleans. Their amphibious ability allowed them to reach flooded neighborhoods where boats couldn't maneuver and trucks couldn't pass. They carried hundreds to safety 60 years after they had carried soldiers to battle. It was as if history itself had called them back for one last mission. In that moment, the circle closed. The machines that had once brought life to a dying beach now brought life to a drowning city. The DUKW's true genius, in the end, was not mechanical, it was philosophical. It represented a way of thinking that turned barriers into pathways. Where others saw the sea as a divide, its creators saw opportunity. Where others saw impossibility, its drivers saw a challenge to outlast. The DUKW proved that in war and perhaps in all human struggle, the greatest advantage lies not in strength or speed, but in adaptability. When the Germans laughed at the first photographs of those odd, high-sided American duck trucks, they saw absurdity. They couldn't imagine a vehicle that could swim through surf and roll onto land without stopping. They couldn't imagine that something so unglamorous could alter the outcome of a continent. But they learned, slowly, painfully, they learned as their own armies found themselves outpaced not by tanks or planes, but by trucks that could go anywhere. Today, a few DUKWs still survive in working condition. Their engines rumble with the same stubborn heartbeat they had 80 years ago. They sit in museums, on private farms, or in the hands of collectors who take them to lakes on weekends, not as weapons, but as relics of a time when imagination was the most powerful tool in the arsenal. They are reminders that history isn't always written by the machines that fired the loudest. Sometimes, it's written by the ones that simply refuse to stop. The DUKW was never beautiful, it was never famous, but it was everything victory required: reliable, resilient, relentless. In a war defined by superweapons and symbols of destruction, the duck truck became something else entirely, a symbol of endurance. And maybe that's the truest measure of greatness. Because while the tanks rusted, the ships sank, and the planes fell, silent, the DUKW kept going across water, across sand, across time itself. It began as an experiment, it ended as a legend. The Germans laughed until they saw an army riding the tide, and when the waves carried those duck trucks toward Normandy, history itself learned to swim. The men who drove the DUKWs grew old quietly. Most never thought of themselves as heroes. They had done their duty, the same as millions of others, and when the war ended, they went home to small towns, took jobs, raised families, and rarely spoke of the things they had seen. Their medals were modest, their stories often untold. But for those who remembered, the image of a DUKW climbing out of the sea never faded. Some nights, they still heard the sound, the low growl of the engine echoing across the surf, the splash of waves against steel, the clang of cargo chains. They remembered the feel of the wheel in their hands as the tide pulled sideways, the way the machine seemed to sense the balance between floating and sinking, life and death. Most people see war through the lens of destruction. The DUKW drivers saw it through motion, the endless need to move forward, to connect what was broken, to make the impossible route passable again. In the decades that followed, the world changed faster than anyone could have imagined. The Cold War came and went, men walked on the moon, and technology transformed every corner of life. Yet, somewhere beneath the noise of progress, the lessons of the DUKW lingered invisible but not gone. It wasn't just a machine, it was an idea. That invention doesn't have to be beautiful to be brilliant. That victory isn't always about firepower, sometimes it's about foresight. During the 1,980 seconds, military historians began to revisit the logistics of World War II with new appreciation. They found that for every rifleman on the front lines, there were 9 others working to feed, fuel, and supply him. The DUKW was one of the few machines that linked every layer of that system from cargo holds to combat zones. One historian wrote in the Journal of Military Logistics, "The DUKW blurred the distinction between sea and land. It turned geography itself into an extension of supply." That simple observation captured the essence of the Allied advantage, mobility that ignored boundaries. But the DUKW's story didn't end in history books. For a new generation, it re-emerged as an unlikely teacher. In engineering schools, students studied its design, the first vehicle to use onboard tire inflation systems, decades before such technology became standard in modern trucks. Its hull design, a balance between hydrodynamics and traction, became a case study in adaptive engineering. In leadership courses, the DUKW appeared as a metaphor. Flexibility under fire. How do you keep moving when conditions change faster than you can plan for? How do you stay afloat when the tide turns against you? For those who studied logistics, it was no longer just a piece of history, it was a model for resilience itself. In the early 2000s, filmmakers and documentarians began rediscovering the forgotten stories of World War II's silent machines. One such film, Engines of Victory, devoted a full segment to the DUKW. The narration opened with a single haunting line. "They said it looked ridiculous until it became the most important truck in Europe." In interviews, the few surviving drivers spoke with humility. 1. A man named Charles Red Murphy from Kansas had driven a DUKW on Omaha Beach when he was 21. Sitting beside the restored vehicle at a museum in 2004, he said quietly, "We were told it was a duck, never thought I'd see it fly." He laughed softly, then added, "But it did. Every time it brought a man home, it flew a little." Moments like that rehumanized the machine not as a technical marvel, but as a companion in survival. By the 2010 seconds, the DUKW had achieved a strange dual life. Half of its identity was nostalgia, tourist rides, and historical reenactments. The other half was reverence, a mechanical relic of courage. In 2019, during the 75th anniversary of D-Day, veterans and their descendants gathered at Arromanches. A handful of working DUKWs rolled through the surf once more. As the crowd applauded, the drivers, many of them grandchildren of the original crews, saluted the sea. The moment was not about machinery. It was about memory, about honoring an idea that progress often forgets, that small, simple things, done with persistence, can move mountains, or, in this case, armies. Still, the DUKW's journey was not without tragedy in later years. In the early 2000s and 2010 seconds, several converted tour DUKWs were involved in fatal accidents in the US and UK, their aging hulls compromised by decades of wear. The incidents forced cities to retire or heavily modify the surviving vehicles. For some, it felt like a sad final chapter, the end of a legend. But for others, it served as a reminder that even the strongest machines, like the people who built them, must eventually rest. Historians argued that those accidents should not overshadow the DUKW's wartime legacy. One curator from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans said it best, "These machines were never built to entertain. They were built to survive the impossible, and they did." The more one studies the DUKW, the more symbolic it becomes. It represents the invisible labor that underwrites every triumph, the engineers, the mechanics, the logisticians who turn strategy into reality. During the invasion of Normandy, the world saw the courage of soldiers storming the beaches. Few saw the quiet genius of the men behind them, the planners who made sure every bullet, every ration, every drop of fuel reached its mark. The DUKW was their symbol, a bridge between chaos and order, a reminder that even in war, progress begins not with destruction, but with connection. There's a deeper irony too, one the Germans themselves recognized in hindsight. The same nation that mocked the DUKW in 1942 would, by 1945, build its own versions in desperation. Late-war German documents describe efforts to develop Landwasserschlepper, amphibious tractors, meant to imitate the Allies' mobility. None were produced in significant numbers before the war ended. The industrial imbalance was too great, the time too short. In the ruins of post-war Europe, German engineers studied captured DUKWs with fascination. Some later contributed to the design of amphibious vehicles for NATO and civilian projects, acknowledging their grudging admiration for the machine that had once symbolized their defeat. One former Wehrmacht officer, interviewed years later, summed it up succinctly. "We had better tanks, perhaps, but they had the better system. Their trucks won the war as much as their guns." As the last veterans passed away, the DUKW's story risked fading again. But memory has a way of surfacing, much like the vehicle itself, rising from waves that seem to swallow it, only to roll forward once more. In 2024, a new documentary project funded by several museums sought to restore 3 original DUKWs for an educational exhibit. Each one would represent a theatre of war: Normandy, the Pacific, and Korea. The restorers found that the core of each vehicle, though corroded, was still structurally sound. The steel had endured. As one of the team leaders put it, "You can't kill something that was built to survive the sea." That phrase became the project's tagline, and perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the machine's legacy. Today, the DUKW exists not just as a historical artifact, but as a living parable about adaptation. Its spirit can be seen in the hovercrafts that glide over water and land, in the amphibious armoured transports that deliver humanitarian aid, and in every innovation that refuses to accept the limits of environment. When modern engineers face a design problem, a rover for Mars, a rescue craft for flooded cities, they echo the same philosophy that birthed the DUKW. Make it move anywhere, make it survive everything. That's not just engineering, it's endurance given form. In one museum display, a single DUKW sits under dim light, its olive paint faded, its tires cracked. Beside it, a small plaque reads simply, "DUKW amphibious truck, served 1942, 1973. Where men could not go, it went." Visitors walk past without realizing that the object before them once carried the future of Europe in its steel belly. But those who stop and look long enough can sense it, the weight of history that hums quietly through rivets and rust. It's the sound of ingenuity, of persistence, of a world that refused to sink, and perhaps that's the truest ending of all. Because the DUKW's story isn't just about machines or war. It's about what happens when imagination meets necessity, when ordinary people, faced with impossible odds, find ways to cross the uncrossable. It's about how laughter, the laughter of the skeptics, the cynics, the ones who said it couldn't be done, always comes before awe. They laughed at the duck truck. They called it a joke, but history has a strange sense of humour. The very machine that drew ridicule ended up defining an entire generation's victory not through fire, but through endurance. And when the tides of history rose, it didn't retreat, it swam. The DUKW was never meant to be remembered. It was meant to work, and it did. Through storm and surf, through mud and gunfire, it carried hope from ship to shore. It carried men who never made it home, and those who did. It carried a war across the water and brought peace back again. And long after the guns went silent, its lesson remained. When the world builds walls, build a way to float over them. They called it a duck. But ducks, after all, are made to survive the storm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.